Thanks for joining me for our prelude to a fabulous concert ahead by the Maryland Symphony Orchestra and our featured soloist, guitar virtuoso Sharon Isbin. We'll be talking with Sharon pretty soon, but in the meantime, I'd like to tell you about some of the other music that is on the program. Each of the composers is Italian, and that is by design. When Sharon was engaged to play with us, it was actually for last season. And of course, COVID put a stop to all of our performances after, well, starting last March, a year ago. And so we asked Sharon to come join us this season with the hope that we could repeat the exact same program that we had planned on last season. Alas, it was not to be. Although there is a light at the end of the tunnel with vaccinations and we hope herd immunity in the coming months, still we have limited space on the stage for a full orchestra. In fact, we can only fit 21 players, a soloist and a conductor safely at this point. Although this will be our first concert opening up the balcony to a small number of audience members. So this will be both a virtual performance and a live performance. And I can tell you that all of us are looking forward to greeting audience members in the theater. It changes the dynamic. There's something special about the give and take of a performance with a live audience. We look forward to inviting you to join us in future concerts. Throughout the season, we have a few more left this season, and we do plan on opening up the theater to more audience members as safety and regulations permit. So stay tuned. We hope that we will soon have a reunion in person. So a contingency, we've called this season a Reimagined season, and that's because we've had to really reprogram our season a couple times over. In the case of this concert, we're moving from Rodrigo and a large work of Respighi to smaller works that also include and feature the guitar, but also will work well for the small forces we have, in this case, string players from our orchestra. And so while we can't do the Pines of Rome for this concert, and we'll plan it for a future season, Respighi wrote, thankfully, one of his suites, the Ancient Airs and Dances suites, he wrote for strings only. And so that's his third suite. It's a suite he wrote late in his life. And it has a different scope to it, a slightly different feeling to it than the other more upbeat, robust suites. One that he wrote in 1916 as a young composer, and then one later, which he wrote for the Cincinnati Symphony, and then one in the 1930s as things were changing for him. Unfortunately, and he was not ill, but in 1936 he had surgery, and because there were no antibiotics, he died of an infection. My goodness, what a few more decades, how that would have changed his life and our experience of his music. This third suite was written in 1932, and I think it incorporated a great deal of the developments in his life, and it affected the choices that he made in terms of the music that he wrote and arranged. He was a musicologist in many ways, although more to unearth the music of the past in order to recast it for the audience of the present. He used the language of his time. It was a very romantic language. He was considered in his lifetime the greatest living Italian composer after Puccini. And I think he took that very seriously. He did not really espouse the avant-garde models of German music and the music of Schoenberg and atonality, rather embraced the music of the late Romantics, and really came from that generation. In 1932, he was writing some of his large-scale works, but this was written for the Conservatory in Milan and perhaps as a commission. And it brings forth music of the 16th century, cast in a sense of string sound that can only come from the 20th century in terms of sonority and in terms of the way that he uses, in some ways, modern techniques for his string writing. There are 4 movements to this suite. And although the second movement has 7 sections, the first and third movements are anonymous composers whose melodies he borrowed. And the thing is that these were written for the lute. They were songs, court songs, and dances, but they only had the melody. And so all the harmonization and all the orchestration is Respighi's own. And this is what allows it to sound like Respighi, kind of putting on a 16th century hat, as opposed to the other way around, where he is trying to be very authentic and recreate in some way the sounds of the 16th century lute. And in this way, this was what was going on in the early 20th century. The idea of musicology was still forming, the idea of doing something authentically and trying to recreate the sights and sounds of times past was not at the forefront, but rather something to bring music of the past, kind of update it and make it enjoyable for the ears of the present. And I think that that's why sometimes when we look at films that we call period films, we look at, Bette Davis playing Queen Elizabeth or something like that, we kind of laugh because she's got huge mascara on, eye makeup, and maybe Elizabeth did wear makeup. There's no question that she had lead paint on her and everything, but the Hollywood aesthetic is quite different from the Elizabethan aesthetic. And yet they were bringing those characters, those historic figures forward to the present audience and telling stories about them and through them that would appeal to the audience of the present. And in that same way, composers who took music of the past, the far past, they were recasting in order to tell the stories of the present. The first movement is an Italian song. It has no attribution in terms of its composer. It's very beautiful, and it allows Respighi to present something very simply and immediately engage you with the beautiful string writing. He was a violinist and a violist of the highest level, having played viola in the royal court in St. Petersburg and studied with Rimsky-Korsakov. Which is why his orchestrations, especially when you think of the larger orchestra works, are just so thrilling. He really knew how to use an orchestra well, and he certainly knew the sounds of the strings and how to combine them in ways that were both dramatic and beautiful. The second movement is a grouping of court songs by a composer, Bessardo, who is not well known, not well known today, but because of this piece, we are lucky enough to hear that he was very creative and I'm sure entertained his court very well with his melodies. It's cast in 7 movements of slow, contrasting with faster movements. And Respighi is able to weave this all together by choosing harmonizations and similar kinds of motives from one song to the next. It's a very, very skillful journey through the music of Bessardo, and it leaves you with a sense of completeness within that second movement. So we have like a suite within a suite. The third movement is a Sicilian. It's a slow dance, very romantic, still approached by composers like Ravel in the early 20th century. It was a popular dance that lasted for centuries, at least in the compositional approach and interest in orchestral music. And then the third movement is, again, that's the Sicilian. The fourth movement is by a composer, Roncalli. This is a 17th century composer. The first three pieces come from the 16th century. Roncalli was 17th century early classical, or rather Baroque composer. And he uses the form of passacaglia, which Bach would have used, and it is one in which a repeated bass line is covered on top with lots of variations, so that you feel a kind of organic evolution of the music, even as it repeats harmonically. It ends a little bit with melancholy, perhaps to a reflection of the times. The 1930s were the beginnings of rumblings of Mussolini and change in Europe. And also for Respighi, his style was changing as well. The second work on the program isn't new exactly. It was written in 2000 by a young composition student at the Juilliard School. Her name is Paula Prestini. And in 2021, she is one of the most important composers in America. She was born in Italy, and her father was a son of a great instrument maker in Italy, and took the business to the United States, sort of, I think, in probably the 1960s, and set up a factory in Arizona. So he took his family, including young Paola, to America when she was quite young. She identifies as American, although certainly is very proud of her Italian roots, and visited that country on vacation throughout her childhood. But because she was living on the border with Mexico in Arizona, she also was given the opportunity to engage with not only Mexican music, not only the songs and dances of that country, but also the music of Latin America. And so it is not surprising that she would take the dance rhythm of the tango as a jumping off point for this composition, this early composition. These days, she is always on the list of the most innovative people of 2020, or the 30 most important young composers. Or she is, you will always find her on the list of the most innovative, the most entrepreneurial, and the most creative. She is someone who mentors young composers and young creative artists. She is a collaborative artist. Her focus has turned more toward opera, which in and of itself is a collaborative art. It involves so many different people to make it happen. While she is involved in the musical side, she also collaborates with visual artists, computer artists, puppeteers, all sorts of theatrical and indie rock. She brings in so much to her productions. She is world-renowned, and someone that I certainly admire a great deal for the fact that her vision of how to keep classical music alive is in the act of collaboration, in the act of renewal, and constantly renewing her art, and in bringing forth the voices of today and tomorrow in all that she does. She is quite extraordinary. And I hope you have a chance to explore her works, which are available online and through YouTube. And then eventually when we can go back into the concert hall, if you ever see anything by Paula Prestini, I urge you to seek it out. It's very inventive and quite affecting. The work that we're doing is based on a tango. It's called Tango. It was written originally for a double string quartet and a bass player, and then she adapted it for string orchestra at the request of the Juilliard Juilliard Orchestra for a performance by them. She says it's a gestural play on the dance form. You hear the dance of the tango intermixed with sort of fantasy-like interruptions, ending with, as she says, the rhythmic underpinnings of the tango. And even though this was written while she was a young student back at the turn of the century in the year 2000, there is all of the makings of her as a mature artist already there. The idea of melodic lines, the idea of counterpoint, but the idea of textures, of background and foreground, something very cinematic and visual about this piece. It's only 6 minutes long, but it engages you because of the interplay of layers of music. One, you will hear the melodies, but you will also hear great textures going on in the background, and also things going on at different rates of time, which gives depth to the music. And in some ways, again, evokes that fantasy that she is telling us, interrupts the dance with. It's a clever piece, and it is, I hope, a sort of opportunity for you to hear a voice of today, and one that is extremely important in America right now in terms of thinking about the future of where classical music, where performance is going to go, and how it will reflect us in our time, but also be open to the voices of world music, of many diverse sources, and at the same time allowing us to engage with a piece of her music to bring forth the idea of a composer engaging in dance forms of the past, which is the theme of this program. And soon we'll talk with Sharon Isbin about the second half of the program, in which both Vivaldi and Boccherini are also engaged in dance forms, bringing them to their audiences, and how the adaptation of music for the lute in terms of the Vivaldi has been changed so that audiences of today can engage with a composer like Vivaldi, who was, with the exception of his Four Seasons, pretty much lost to time until the 21st century. So this idea of composers sort of taking materials of the past and reweaving them into music that reflects the present and also engages the audience is at the forefront of the theme of this concert. And now I am joined by the guest artist for the second half of our program, Sharon Isbin. Sharon, we're so happy to have you back with us. This is Plan C, I think, in terms of how we have programmed our upcoming concert. Last year, you were to come and help us celebrate the magical music of Christopher Rouse with his Concerto di Gaudì. I hope I said that correctly. And also the Rodrigo famous Concerto d'Aranjuez. Unfortunately, those call for larger forces. And in COVID land, we have to keep it at 21 people on stage, plus soloist and conductor. So you graciously allowed us to reprogram with two magnificent works for guitar and strings, the first being Vivaldi's Concerto in D, originally for lute, but played very successfully by guitar. And I think it's a piece that you know very well and that you have a great history with. And maybe we can start with that, speaking about the great Vivaldi and this magnificent work.
Well, it's first of all wonderful to be back with the Maryland Symphony Orchestra. We have a long storied history together, and of course, Elizabeth, to be performing with you. So I feel this is a really positive forward step during these difficult times to be able to make music together on the stage for your beautiful and wonderful audience and your marvelous players. I've been watching all of the streams and I'm just overwhelmed by how beautiful everyone is sounding. In the Vivaldi, we'll have a chance to hear 3 different movements. The 2 outer ones are fast, allegro, and then the slower movement, the largo, is one where you can really hear the performer express, especially in the repeats, something of their own voice, because it calls for embellishment, which is a sense of variation. In jazz, of course, you have musicians improvising, and in the Baroque time, in the slow movements, there would be a chance for the musicians to do the same. So you'll hear elaborations of the first playing done in much more filigree the second time. And all of that is conceived to be able to make a sense of whole and beauty.
The first movement, of course, is a very upbeat ritornello form of it's a passage that the players play and that is repeated throughout the movement. We return to it. It's a very standard form that develops into sonata form later on with 2 contrasting themes, a major and a minor, the peppy major, and then a little bit more melancholy minor theme in the first movement. So that gives us a great sense of the arrival and is able to, I think it's the movement in which the orchestra and the soloist can communicate the most in terms of give and take. The next movement that you mentioned, the second movement, I'd love it if you could go in a little bit more in terms of the importance historically, stylistically, of the second movement and repeating, and how and why you don't take the repeats the exact same way.
Well, one of the things that we've gotten used to as 20th and 21st century artists is to see all the instructions on the page. And in Baroque music, that was not the case. The performers had a sense of what we could now call Baroque performance practice, which meant that they knew how to improvise trills, more than passing notes, and other kinds of elaborations that, particularly when employed during the repeat, would make it sound fresh and new with a different kind of vision. So that was typical of the Baroque time, and it's something that we as performers now have to do. If you were to hear it played exactly the same way in a slow movement, there'd be something wrong with that approach. So having studied for 10 years with the great Bach scholar and keyboard artist Rosalind Turek, in my work with her, especially focused on the music of Bach, which is in that same context, one where the performer has to add their own voice in the elaborations and the repeats. So to transfer that to Vivaldi is very easy for me and makes a lot of sense because I'm already familiar with that kind of language.
It's sort of the secret for the musicians. We listen very carefully to how people take their repeats. To me, it reminds me of how we view Greek statues and Roman statues, the white, the pure marble, the beauty of the stone itself, and the actual folds and shadows of those are given a kind of ghostly presence, when in reality they were all gaudily painted, and some of them even wore clothing during that, so it reminds me that sometimes what's written on the page, the composer assumed that the practice would be followed. And also, I don't think that composers thought that their music would live much past the performance. It's a different mindset, I think, from 300 years ago. These performances were often one-off. Sometimes they'd be performed in different cities, but within the composer's lifetime, and the idea of something lasting in perpetuity and having to notate every single practice and technique variation was something that just wasn't top of mind for composers, I would think, until pretty much the 20th century, when things started to be reproduced in recordings. And the idea of a piece lasting beyond the life of a composer was a given by the early 20th century. So the last movement of the Vivaldi is, someone has likened it to a kind of tarantella. It's much more gentle than a tarantella in a way. It's much more bouncy, but it has that kind of triple meter or compound meter. Definitely a dance, and a very delightful way. Can you tell me a little bit more about this concerto? And because it is adapted from the lute, which had many more strings and is a completely different instrument, and I'm not saying that, I don't think you've ever played the lute. Have you played the
No,
lute?
I've never played the lute. And the major
Okay.
difference, the major adaptation in this is not really so much lots of lute strings, because that wasn't really employed in the original version, but it's that there was no viola part. So Emilio Pujol, the Spanish guitarist and composer from the late 19th century, early 20th century, he's the one who created this setting, added a viola part, and just gave it a sense of body and depth when adding guitar to it. And instead of the lute part, which is mirroring the violin, Pujol decided to create this as a solo vehicle for the guitar.
Fantastic. The idea, and throughout this concert, the idea of adapting folk music, folk dance, or court dances, court songs, and bringing them to the current audience is something that's a theme throughout this program. And it's a great reminder that even though we are hearing Vivaldi, we're hearing it through the musical mind of someone who had other intentions for it in order to adapt it for the guitar and to make it more rich for the current listener. It changes. It's fascinating. Now we're going to move to the final work on the program, and this is actually our adaptation of a piece of Baroque or early classical music by Boccherini. It's a quintet for guitar. It's actually, quintet for string quartet and guitar. And we are kitting it out with a string section and a bass player. And of course, the very special pièce de résistance is the last section of the last movement, which is the great and famous Fandango, which also includes the presence of a percussionist who will play both the castanets and the tambourine in a part that I don't know whether you fashioned it or someone that you worked with fashioned, but it's quite a virtuosic part for the percussionist at the end, and gives quite the flair to the work, adds that flair to the work. Was the percussion initially Boccherini's intention? Is it written into the part?
It's not written into the parts, so this is something a castanet player
Into the score?
can adapt and improvise with. When I recorded it with the Pacifica String Quartet, a recent album, we had a player who just improvised his part, and it was different each time. So all of that adds to the flair. But when you think about the dance that is the Fandango, that is the last movement of the Boccherini that we played, and you think about the origins, I think what will give you a sense of the spirit is to quote from Casanova, of all people. And I'm just going to read this to you. He describes seeing a fandango in 1767 in Madrid. And he said, each couple, man and woman, taking no more than 3 steps at a time and clicking castanets to the sound of the orchestra, makes 1,000 gestures, take 1,000 attitudes with a lasciviousness with which nothing can compare. This dance is an expression of love from beginning to end, from the sigh of desire to the ecstasy of enjoyment. So the idea of adding castanets is just in keeping with the Spanish character. And if you think about Boccherini's life, he lived most of his life in Spain, even though he was an Italian composer, and was influenced very much by Spanish music. So this particular movement is one that captures that essence of what was the real vogue at that time in Spain. And the other 2 movements actually come from different pieces. So Boccherini kind of culled them and put them together.
Well, now that really makes sense because there is a sense of 3 separate movements, 3 very different feelings, completely. The first being a pastoral, gently flowing kind of music. The second being more an aria, and then of course the third being the dance. It has the structure of a concerto in some ways, but this idea of chamber music in which the guitar is part of the group. So our audience will not expect the same kind of virtuosity except in moments in which the rest of the group takes a little bit of a step back. The rest of the group takes a little bit of a step back.
And it makes sense that you're adapting this with string orchestra because Boccherini adapted this himself. It was originally, he wrote a number of different quintets for string quartet and extra cello. And then he had a friend who was a guitarist and he wanted to create this set for that person to be able to play. So he took the extra cello part and gave it to the guitar and reconfigured, and that's how we ended up with a number of string quintets for guitar and quartet.
Well, we know that Boccherini's father was a cellist. I don't know if his grandfather was as well, but that instrument has the cello has a very prominent part even still in this quintet, and our principal cellist has been looking forward to approaching the heights of the very high passages of this. It was known that Boccherini could play his cello in the range of the violin and loved to show off. We call that thumb position, where you put your thumb on the string and you're way, 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 way close to the bridge, playing very high. And that he was looked upon as quite the virtuoso on the cello. And so one can imagine that he himself possibly played these quintets with his friend who was the guitarist. And what a virtuoso he must have been.
And this is one of the favorites because of the Fandango.
Certainly it certainly has a following. It is one that gets everyone up, off, out of their chairs at the end because it's just such a really rousing end. So we have sort of an adventure happening in terms of adapting to a new way of performance. We will be performing for a very small live audience for the first time this season. Those who opted to buy tickets and come to hear live have been unfortunately not able until our concert will allow a few of our ticket holders to actually come and hear us. They'll be sitting up in the balcony, but it will be a very different experience to be performing for an audience right in the same hall. I'm excited about that. I know that for you, this will also be, I believe, the first time that you're coming back to live performance. Is that right?
It is the first time that I'll be actually on a stage since the pandemic began, and it's a homecoming to return to the Maryland Symphony because our last performance together was the world premiere of the Chris Brubeck Concerto, which we then recorded the world premiere of in 2018, and the album came out called Affinity, which is the name of the guitar concerto that Chris wrote for me. That album came out last year, last summer, and Elizabeth, you are conducting the Maryland Symphony. It's a spectacular recording. It's gotten great reviews. It's been named Best of 2020 in many media, radio, and press publications. So it has been quite a success, and the entire album features world premieres of works that have been written for me. The other composers on that are Leo Brouwer, Richard Danielpour, with Isabel Leonard doing the mezzo-soprano part to that particular piece. There's a work by Tan Dunn and a duet by Antonio Lauro, which I play with a former student of mine, Colin Davin, who has arranged a beautiful second guitar part. And I might even do that as a solo, as in an encore in this particular concert. So keep your ears tuned to that. And I felt very fortunate as well that at the same time, the same day, in fact, that Affinity, the album was released, that another work of mine, an album called Strings for Peace, which I did with India's most famous sarod player, another plucked instrument, and his two virtuoso sons, Amananayan Alibangash and Tabla. This came out at the same time, also world premieres of works that Amjad Ali Khan composed for all of us to do, and that followed just a couple months after a big tour we had done in India in 2019. So all of this preceded the pandemic and landed in our laps in the summer of 2020, and I'm so glad that we've been able to share this music with everyone.
Well, we were certainly proud to be part of Affinity. That was a very special experience for us as an orchestra, and a privilege to perform with you and to be able to give that work by Chris Brubeck life. What a wonderful person he is, and what a thrill it was to be involved in making that recording with you, Sharon. We look forward to your performance.
Thank you.
And we'll think up some new ways to get back to Christopher Rouse and Rodrigo in future seasons. But for now, Vivaldi and Boccherini hold great delights, and I know that our audience is really chomping at the bit to hear you perform with us. So
Thank you
thank
so
you for
much.
joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.